Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Tactics Board. It's been a tough few weeks for Norwich City, but they've got the opportunity to turn things around again against Bristol City this weekend. Of course, they're back at Carrow Road, and that is a major positive after more than a year unbeaten at home. But they're facing a side who have looked fairly decent at times this season. However, they are coming off the back of a 2-1 loss to Sheffield United in midweek, and there are also areas of their game that Norwich will feel they can exploit. We're going to take a look at those. We're also going to explore the sort of ideological decision that Torup has to make in terms of the players who are available to him and how that affects his system and how he wants to set up. But first of all, we're going to take a look at the 11 that I think Torup will choose for the game. So without further ado, here it is. So I've gone for George Long in goal, Kellum Fisher at right back, Shane Duffy and Jose Cordoba in the centre of defence, with Callum Doyle at left back, Jakob Sorensen, Oscar Schwartau and Emiliano Marcondes in the centre of midfield, Cade Gordon on the right, Borja Sainz on the left and Ante Cianats through the middle up front. We're going to start at the beginning and that choice in goal, where I do think Torup will choose George Long as his goalkeeper. I know there's been a lot of debate around the Norwich fan base around whether he should be in that team once again. Of course, another mistake against Sheffield Wednesday, letting that header slip through his fingers for the second, and arguably should have made himself a little bit bigger for the first as well. I've heard a couple of people saying that maybe he should have been quicker off his line. And also, Yohannes Torup spoke in the pre-match press conference about the fact that Long put his hand up after that mistake, apologised to his teammates and said that it was his fault, or that he did make mistakes in that game. So for all of those reasons, you could say that Archie Mair, the goalkeeper who's been playing reserve to him since Angus Gunn's injury, would be the one to come in. But I don't think that's the case, because we're only one game away from Gunn coming back into the team. Torup confirmed that at his pre-match press conference, that after the international break, it will be him who's in goal. And for the sake of one game, I'd be surprised if Torup wants to upset the apple cart to that extent. As we all know, Long is someone who's liked behind the scenes, who's an asset to the changing room, and whether people like the fact that he's got a new contract or not, he is at the club for a significant period of time from now on. He will be a big part of that project that Torup's undertaking, the rebuild that's still early on in what they're trying to do at Carrow Road. And if you upset him now or create that problem for yourself now, I think the ramifications of that ripple out over a long period of time, when actually the only benefit there is for Norwich would be for one game, really. So I don't see Torup making that decision. I think the way that he spoke about both goalkeepers when he spoke to media earlier today suggested that it would be that way. So although I can understand why everyone's frustrated with George Long at the moment, and I'm sure he's frustrated with his performances as well, I think for the sake of morale and the changing room and the group, Torup will stick with what he's got for one game until Gunn returns, and then I think we all know what happens from there. The other position I wanted to discuss was right wing. It's somewhere we've talked about quite a lot so far on Tactics Board this season, and it's somewhere that really nobody's nailed down yet. Of course, they've had Ante Cianats there early on in the season. With Josh Sargent out injured, he's moved centrally, and that's meant that it's become a little bit of a difficult position for Torup to deal with. He went for Cade Gordon at Sheffield Wednesday, and that definitely wasn't his best performance in yellow and green. Of course, his first start for the club, and I think everyone was optimistic about it, given some of the substitute performances that he's put in. He's scored a goal for the club already, and it looked like the time was ripe for him to go and do well. But he didn't really have much of an impact on the game. When he did get on the ball, he didn't take it forward in the way that Norwich like him to do. He didn't take players on, which is what Torup speaks about as sort of his main characteristic. And he definitely didn't make the impact that some people hoped he would. But I think because of some of Bristol City's weaknesses and the way that Norwich might find some joy this weekend, I'd say Gordon has a decent chance of starting again. Of course, there is Schwartau, who I've got in my midfield, who's played out on the right. He could put him there and maybe put a Mankwa Forsen in midfield instead. But I think he might go for Gordon because, and we'll expand on this, but Bristol City are a bit exposed to counter-attacks, a bit vulnerable to counter-attacks, and that's an area I think Norwich could attack and could expose a little bit this weekend. And you've got someone like Gordon, who is quite direct, who likes to take players on, who has that speed and that athleticism as well as the technical quality to break forward and help on the counter-attack. And I think for those reasons, there's a decent chance he starts again, although I'm not 100% sure, and I could see a change there potentially. But that's the team I'm going with. I think it will be unchanged. However, we could see 1 or 2 changes around that. Now on to the visitors, and there are a few better to explain how they play than Torup. So here he is on the sort of game he expects to pan out before we then break it down and explain what that might mean for Norwich.
Now I think it's maybe not that bad if the game opens up a little bit more, because we don't necessarily have the relations on pitch where players, they just know each other from playing so many games together, so they can just open up a defensive side where they defend with a 5-back line or even more, where if the game gets a little bit more open, then the space gets bigger, and it's not that important with 2, 3, 4 guys seeing the same moment at the same time. So what I see from them and what I know from them is obviously they are a good technical side. They want to create and dominate the game, and they are some good technical players. I think they can play some really, really good football when they are on top. I also see from them that they can change their system and formation game to game, also a little bit dependent on the opposition. So we prepare the best way, but I think actually a little bit more open game will be good for us on Saturday.
On that sort of counter-attacking avenue for offensive productivity that Torup spoke about there, and the way that Norwich could exploit Bristol City in that sense, I actually think they've got a decent team for that at the moment, even with those injuries that are depleting them. They've got Borja Sainz, whose strengths we know and has a bit of that pace, that directness, likes to take players on and exploit big spaces and run in behind as well. You've got Gordon on the other side, who I spoke about earlier, and how he might suit that. Ante Sienats through the middle maybe doesn't have, admittedly, the same physical profile as Josh Sargent, doesn't run in behind as much as him, maybe not the same sort of strength to hold defenders off as well, but he has some of those skills in decent amounts. He's a fairly good physical size, he's got a little bit of pace as well, probably could hold defenders off to a decent standard if you sort of trained him up and got him ready for the game in that sense. In midfield, you've got runners like Marcondes and Schwartau, and even though they don't have that same creativity as the likes of Marcelino Nunez and Anis Ben Sulemane, they will run and they will get into the right areas. They have an instinct for where the ball might drop, and they have both been decent goal scorers at times in their careers as well. So I think that team is set up okay to do that. Of course, they'd rather have the players that are usually available and play the style that they want to play. But I think Torup's point is a good one, and if they can unlock that sort of counter-attacking part of their game, then there probably is some joy to be had against Bristol City. The other area I'd mention that Torup didn't would be set pieces. Bristol City have struggled from that in recent times, and the problem for Norwich there is that they haven't been too good at scoring from them. Of course, they haven't scored a single header so far this season, haven't scored from a set piece, and seem to have lost that part of their arsenal from last season when, of course, they were very good at it. You'd say that they've got a better chance than against most teams against the Robins, but also you have to look at it as a weakness in that a lot of teams would be able to exploit that, and maybe Norwich won't, when it's an area of joy that they could really benefit from in a match that they might find difficult with some of those injuries. But it will be a really interesting aspect of the game, those set pieces, and also it should be quite an interesting game tactically, given both teams want to dominate. Maybe it doesn't suit Norwich as much as it usually would, but I'm sure given the choice, Torup would like to have the ball for most of the game, to dominate, to have possession, and to be proactive rather than sitting back. I'm sure the plan isn't to sit back and then spring the counter-attack. He's just looking at that as when they're forced into defending, that maybe they could go and counter-attack and improve in that sense and make the most of those opportunities. But I think he will still want to control the game. Of course, Bristol City will still want the same as well. So that will be probably quite an important part of the game, who wins that fight for the ball and who wins that possession most of the time. To finish with, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of crossroads or the ideological problem that Torup is facing at the moment. You'd say with the injuries in certain areas that it is getting more and more difficult for him to stick with the principles that he brought to Norwich, with the system that he wants to impart on a long-term basis. You'd say that actually moving to a back five or a back three at times has been a more preferable option in terms of getting the better players in the 11, but he's chosen to stick with what he likes. And I think that is partly down to the game-to-game part of it. He did say when he spoke to media earlier today that actually he likes a back four, that's just his preference, and I think we've seen that throughout his career, but also I think he's got the long-term picture in mind, and that is something that maybe we don't consider as much with tactics, but it does feel like if his work is to have the same sustained impact that Norwich fans want and wanted when he was appointed, that actually sticking to these principles might be the best decision in the long term. That feels like what he's trying to do at the moment. He's answered quite a lot of questions in recent press conferences about the fact that he needs to find that balance and that he's trying to work things so that they can get through the short term with the best possible results, while also continuing with the sort of tactical programme that he's set out. But I think it is interesting that he's stuck mostly with his guns and gone for the system that he's brought to Carrow Road and that he wants to put into this team for a really long period of time. And I think that is encouraging when you look at the bigger picture and the likelihood of success for this project as sort of a whole. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on at the moment. A lot of other things to look out for against Bristol City this weekend, but of course we'll have them all covered across the Pink'Uns. So go to pinkun.com/subscribe if you haven't already, and you'll have access to all of that. Thank you very much for joining me on Tactics Board. Of course, I'll see you again quite soon, although there is an international break between now and then. Of course, Norwich should have some players back by then, so that'll be good news. Maybe if the lack of club football won't be, but I'm sure I'll see you then. Thank you very much for joining me today, and yeah, look forward to speaking to you then when hopefully there's good news in terms of injuries and players coming back, and also hopefully we're looking back on a decent result for Norwich against Bristol City.